Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for Fundamentals of Music. Today we're going to be expanding upon our previous discussion on musical intervals. So we had previously talked about a few music intervals, which we had labeled as the unison, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and octave. And we had kind of been looking at those in the context of the major scale, which is something that we will continue today because it can be useful to help us sort of contextualize these various distances between pitches. So just to sort of reiterate that example, let's go ahead and just draw a treble clef staff here, and let's just talk about how like from C to C would be an example of a unison. Going from C to D would be an example of a second. C going up to E would be our third. C to F would be our fourth, C to G is a fifth, C to A is a sixth, C up to B is a seventh, and then finally C going all the way back up to C would be that octave. So we have these sort of different core intervals, as mentioned, the unison, second all the way up to the octave. And we're going to stick with that pretty much for the rest of this class and future courses as well, the idea of the unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and octave. That's not going to go away for us. We're just going to add some variety and some flavor to these intervals so that we can be a bit more specific in terms of what it is that we're talking about. Another thing that I want to sort of mention in terms of this interval front that we are talking about is this idea of this terminology of like second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and how that's going to stay true despite the information that we're going to add to it. So, for example, we could look at the note C going up to the note G, and we could talk about how that is a fifth. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about today is how that is actually the definition of what we call a perfect fifth, or we label it P5. Now, something we'll talk about in a future lecture, I'm just sort of giving a demonstration here, is that if we were to have C going up to G flat, that would in fact become what we would call a diminished fifth. But the point I'm making here very briefly before going on is the idea that it is still a fifth, and I want you to just kind of hold on to that idea as we progress through this lecture. That despite the fact that we're going to add some various labels and some accidentals, and we're going to sort of shrink and increase the size of these intervals, the idea of calling something a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, or octave, or unison by that same token, is going to stay true based off this sort of like spacing and letter names. In other words, we can look at this here, that the idea of, like I talked about before, how we could go like C, D, E, F, and G, that makes a fifth, so we can sort of count those letter names with one starting on the letter we begin with, the note name we begin with, in this case, C. This is still true for C to G flat, because we could go C, D, E, F, G flat. But you'll notice I'm still counting to 5, and it would also hold true if we did like C up to G sharp. It's going to be a different flavor of fifth, which again, that's a topic for a future video, but I just want to really stress this point that anytime you're unsure of the distance between two pitches, always just do that method of counting the letter names, and that's going to give you a pretty good estimation if not the correct answer outright right away, by just keeping track of the fact. Same idea here, if I did like C going up to E, that would be, as we'll talk about in a second, a major third. And as we'll also talk about in the future, C to E flat would be what we would call a minor third. Again, I'm getting ahead of some points just to demonstrate this idea. We will return to all this. But the distance between these two notes is not the same. One sounds like this. That's our major third. And this is our minor third. But again, they are both thirds because we have like C, D, and E. So just the last point I'll make here before we move on. If I were to have like C to F, it wouldn't matter if this was like C flat and this was F sharp, still a fourth because it's C, D, E, and F. The intervals, the actual distance between those pitches and the accidentals that we add and the sort of different flavors we come up with, that's still going to be a fourth. This could be C sharp and this could be F sharp, and it would still be a fourth because again, C, D, E, and F. So as we get to these sort of, more intricate intervals and these greater varieties of them, it can start to feel overwhelming because you might think, I have so many choices of different intervals between any of these two pitches. So when in doubt, always just count the letter names of the note from one to the next, and you can always get that core identifier, like the idea of this being a second, this being a third, this being a fourth, and so on. You can always get that correct by just doing that, like C, D, E, F. Or it doesn't even matter if you start on C. I could say A, B, C, D. And I know that the distance from A to D is a fourth. Whether that's, as we'll talk about in a second, a perfect fourth or a diminished fourth or an augmented fourth, that we can figure out at a separate step. But knowing that it's a fourth is really, really important. So the last time I'll say it, this information, these core intervals that I've outlined right here, this second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh octave, and unison, that terminology stays, and it's always true if we have the same number of letters and notes spaced in between, like C to B is always a seventh, okay? So keep that in mind as we add some flavors to these intervals. We're going to talk about a couple of those today. We'll add a few more next week. Keep that little bit of information tucked away. So speaking of these different flavors of intervals, we talked before just about the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, etc. Some of these intervals have different flavors than others, but the sort of flavors and varieties that we will add to these intervals are as follows. We will have what we call perfect intervals. That is one of the ones we will focus on today. We will have what we call major intervals. That is the other one we will focus on today. In the future, we will talk about what we call minor intervals. And then we will also have diminished intervals, and we will have augmented intervals. So all 5 of these are different versions of intervals. As a reminder, today we will focus on these 2, but we'll see that it's pretty easy to keep all of these things separate and, sort of keep one different from the other based off their terminology, how they sound, and how they are written and applied in the actual musical context that we will be looking at. So again, today, let's focus on the perfect and major intervals, but once we have those firmly grasped, the minor interval is just a slight offshoot of the major interval. The diminished and the augmented are very similar to perfect, and those can also be applied to major and minor. We'll expand upon all that. But again, today, let's just focus on perfect and major. Since we have this large variety of intervals, again, we'll focus on major and perfect today, but one thing to note is that only certain types of intervals can be major or minor or perfect or augmented or diminished. They can't all be those certain things. So we will say that like seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can have a few different qualities to them, and the qualities which they can exhibit would be major, again, a topic of the day, minor, a topic for the future, augmented, a topic for the future, and diminished. So we could have, for example, a major or minor second. We could have a major or minor third. We could have a major or minor sixth. We could have a major or minor seventh. And we can also have an augmented or diminished second, or an augmented or diminished third, and so on. So these 4 flavors of intervals can be applied to the seventh, sixth, third, and second. The other intervals that remain, which will be our fourth, fifth, and octave, okay, or eighth, if we want to call it that. I'll just write that now to sort of stick with this terminology. Those intervals come with fewer relative flavors. So for example, the fourth, fifth, and octave can come as perfect, or augmented, or diminished. I mention this because it's a good habit to get into right away to recognize that intervals like the fourth, fifth, and octave can never be referred to as major or minor. They can only be referred to as perfect, augmented, or diminished. And I mention this for a couple of reasons. One, we sort of, we have a theoretical definition of major and minor, but we often say that like a major third, which would sound like this, sounds kind of happy, and that a minor third sounds kind of tragic or sad. That's sort of a colloquial thing we agree upon to help distinguish these sounds from each other. But when we play perfect intervals, like the perfect fifth, which is something we will look at today, it doesn't have that sort of necessarily like happy or tragic quality. It's a bit more open of a sound, and it's also similar with the perfect fourth. And the perfect fourth and perfect fifth are very similar to each other, but I just want to explain the reason that we call them perfect intervals is going all the way back to Pythagoras, and it has to do with the ratio of one pitch to the other, and we end up getting really good ratios, like 2-to-1 for the octave, okay? Or we'll get like 3-to-2. The idea is that the ratio between the low pitch and the high pitch is sort of mathematically perfect, and for many years, these intervals, particularly if you go back to like the medieval era, were considered like the only only true consonant intervals. And in fact, even the fourth was sort of considered dissonant for a while, which is pretty remarkable when you consider, the world of sounds we have today, that this was sort of considered dissonant at any point. But I think that historical context, and that's as far as I'll go, is useful for us in remembering why some of these intervals have the word perfect associated with them. And it's only the fourth, fifth, and octave. We will never call a third perfect, or a second perfect, or a sixth, or a seventh. Only fourth, fifth, and octave. Those three intervals, those can be referred to as perfect. They can also be referred to as augmented and diminished, just like seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can, but seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths will be only referred to as major or minor or augmented or diminished, but not perfect, okay? So again, just a little context to try to help make sense of this. Now we'll dive into a bit more material, but this will be useful information to have tucked away in the back of your head. So with that in mind, let's start talking more properly about major and perfect intervals. So let's return to our major scale and our labels of unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and octave. And then let's talk about how major and perfect intervals can be applied to that major scale, because a case can be made that that is the intervals that comprise all of the major scale, is just perfect and major intervals, as long as we're referencing it from the tonic note. So let me show what I'm talking about. So we had previously demonstrated the idea of this major scale, and how we could talk about the distance between any of the pitches of the major scale as a unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. In other words, the distance from C to D would be an example of a second, and the distance from C to E would be an example of a third, and C to F would be an example of a fourth, C to G would be a fifth, C to A would be a sixth, C to B would be a seventh, and then lastly, I'll just draw this one down here, C to C would be an example of an octave. And that's the only terminology we applied. We called, this distance a second, this distance a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, etc. We didn't add any sort of specificity beyond those. But now we're going to do that, because the specificity of what type of second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. is important in defining the major scale and defining the sound world we get as a result of those intervals. So if we reference every interval of the major scale from the tonic note, we will only get major and perfect intervals. So let me show you what I mean. The distance from C to D could be labeled as a major second, or a whole step. And I've used some of that terminology before, how we have whole steps and half steps. A half step is a minor second, and a whole step is a major second. And on the keyboard, the distance from C to D has a note in between, which would be C sharp or D flat. So we can say that going from C to D is a whole step, or two half steps, or a major second. And the major second is sort of the grown-up theory version of saying whole step versus half step. So rather than saying half step and whole step going forward, we will now primarily say minor second or major second. And in this case, we're focusing on the major second. We could say that the distance from C to E is a major third. We could say that the distance from C to F is a perfect fourth, because again, as a reminder, fourths and fifths can be perfect, just as octaves can. We could say that C up to G is an example of a perfect fifth. We could say that C up to A is an example of a major sixth. We could say that C up to B is an example of a major seventh. And then, not surprisingly, we could say that C going up to C would be an example of a perfect octave. So notice that the intervals inherent in this major scale structure relative to C are all major or perfect intervals. We don't have minor intervals, we don't have augmented intervals, and we don't have diminished intervals. We will talk about those in the near future, and again, we're going to continue talking about major and perfect intervals for the rest of this lecture, but just note how those are the only intervals present. And if we play them, it sounds like such. So from C to D is our major second. From C to E is our major third. From C to F is our perfect fourth. From C to G is our perfect fifth. C to A major sixth. And C to B, our major seventh. And then finally, C going back up to C is our octave or perfect octave. Quite often, if we just say octave, we mean perfect octave. You can have diminished octaves and you can have augmented octaves. We often just don't say perfect octave, we just say octave. But note that the proper term would be perfect octave, which will sound as. Now, keep in mind that we won't always just be measuring intervals from the tonic, but it's a good way to get us started, and it's a good way to help us stay key signature referential and sort of frame how we talk about these things relative to the major and minor key signatures and scales, because we want to make sure we really firmly know those, and if we do, it can help us out tremendously. So just to sort of give you an example of what I'm talking about, right now I've shown you all of these intervals labeled as major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, etc., and that is true. That is what those intervals are in the major scale, but we could also sort of label these in terms of half steps. So for example, we could say that the major second equals 2 half steps, right? We would start on C, we would go up 1 half step and then land on D, so it would be 2 half steps away. We could also say that the major third equals 4 half steps. We could also say that the perfect fourth equals 5 half steps, and then we could say that the perfect fifth equals 7 half steps, and then we could say that the major sixth equals 9 half steps, and then we could lastly say that the major seventh equals 11 half steps, finally getting us up to 12 half steps to get us back to the octave if we wanted to think about it that way. But this idea of sort of counting half steps is a bit cumbersome and tedious. So for example, if I gave you the note, E flat, and I said, what's a perfect fifth up from E flat? If you had to sort of picture a keyboard and go E flat to E to F sharp to G sharp to A to B flat and count like 7 individual half steps, that will get you the answer, and I think that counting half steps is something to keep in mind as a way to sort of solve intervals when they're presented to you, but it's not the quickest way, and there's better ways to sort of frame how we approach these, to memorize them, and to reference them to other things we already know, like the major scale and major key signatures, and soon the minor scale and the minor key signatures. So yes, there are sort of half-step definitions of these intervals. So for example, a perfect fifth is always 7 half steps apart, and when in doubt, and if you just can't figure it out, sure, count half steps, but let's talk about some other ways to sort of help calculate and figure out what these intervals are, especially as we move away from this neat little structure of like the C major scale and measuring them this way. So to calculate an interval using this idea of the major scale as a reference, we could do as follows. So let's say I provide you with this note of A flat, and I ask for a perfect fifth above. You need to provide which pitch is a perfect fifth above from A flat. So what do you do? Well, as a reminder, you could count 7 half steps and go like, okay, well, A flat and then the A and then B flat and a B natural and a C. But that's going to take time and you'll make mistakes and you could be nervous. This is why, among many reasons, having your major key signatures memorized is super important, because if we know our major key signature for A flat major, we can solve this very quickly. So anytime you're given a pitch, what I would do is I would treat that as the tonic. In this little out of context example, it doesn't matter whether it's the tonic or the mediant or the leading tone. So let's just call it the tonic and say that that is scale degree 1 and treat it like we're in A flat major, because we know that in A flat major, a fifth above A flat will be a perfect fifth if we follow the key signature of A flat major. Because if we're in C major and we have C and then we have G, it will automatically be a perfect fifth, labeled as such, because the key signature creates that for us. In other words, there's not some like random G sharp in the key signature of C that suddenly make this not a perfect fifth. That's impossible. In the world of C major, a fifth up from C will give us a perfect fifth, which means if we pretend we're in A flat major, which we could be, or if we just say we are for the context of this example, we can know what a perfect fifth above A flat is. So what I would do is count letters, just like I was saying. I would do A, B, C, D, and E. And if you follow that step, you already know that E is going to be the letter name and the note that I write. And that is true 100% of the time. Doesn't matter if I ask for a perfect, augmented, diminished, doesn't matter. It's going to be that letter name because a fifth is defined as A, B, C, D, and E. So we already know that this note is correct. It has to be because it is a fifth up from the tonic, in this case, of A flat. Now, if we know our key signature of A flat major, and hopefully you are starting to memorize those, we know that it has B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. Those are the 4 flats in the key signature of A flat. And you'll notice that one of those would apply to this note because we have an E flat. So all we have to do is bring that note down, make this E flat, and we will suddenly have a perfect fifth. And that can work on any interval within the major scale. So for example, let's say I give you the note F, And let's say I want a major 7th, okay? Start with the same thing. Go like F, G, A, B, C, D, and then E. Okay, so I know that a 7th up from F is E. I can write that, and I know I'm already halfway there. Then I ask myself, well, pretend F is the tonic. What is the key signature of F major? And hopefully you have memorized that it is 1 flat. And in this case, that B flat has nothing to do with E or F. It's not affected by this key signature because those notes do not have accidentals in the key signature. So we can just leave it as F to E, and we will know that it is a major 7th 100% of the time. And it will always work. Let's do one other example. Let's say that we are starting on the pitch A, and I want a major 3rd up from A. So what would that be? Well, again, do this. Go A, B, and C. Haha! I know that it has to be C because I'm counting and I'm using my long and bony fingers, and it takes me from A to B to C, all right? And that works. Now I ask myself, well, what is the key signature of A major? And you might remember that it has 3 sharps, F, C, and G. And if I have F, C, and G sharp in A, and we're pretending that A is my temporary tonic, well, we would have to bring that C sharp down and make it A to C sharp, and that would give us a major 3rd. So this is one example of a way you can help figure out these intervals by always referencing them to the major scale. This is a good system. At a certain point, you'll start to just kind of memorize these things, to be honest, but this is a really great way to more quickly figure them out, and it's also going to force you to have these key signatures memorized, which again is something you need to be able to just pull these out very quickly. If I ask for D flat major, you should be able to just say right away how many flats or sharps that is. There should be no amount of time for thinking. 5 seconds at the absolute most is all you should need to figure out any key signature. Now, the method I just outlined will really help us write intervals, but quite often what we really need to do is look at intervals in a piece of music and label them properly, because a lot of our time is going to be spent looking at real music and trying to analyze it and label it in a meaningful way. So just to show the sort of corollary to this, but it works very similarly. So for example, let's say I had an interval of F and B flat. I was given those 2 notes, and I'm asked to label, well, what is this interval, okay? It works just like it did before. I can just assume that F is my temporary tonic. I can think of it as scale degree 1, and I can count F, G, A, and B, and I know that at some level this is going to be a 4 because the letter spacing dictates that it's a 4th. So then the question becomes, well, is this a perfect 4th? Is this augmented or diminished? Well, you can imagine, because today we're not talking about 2 of those, that this is in fact a perfect interval, which is true. This is a perfect 4th, but we can also tell because if we were pretending that we were in F major, just like we were a minute ago, it would have a key signature of B flat, 1 flat in the key signature, and we see here that we are given F to B flat, so it must be a perfect 4th because that is the 4th scale degree of the F major scale. So all of these things really do connect, which is why you really want to make sure you have all of these things pretty well understood. Let's take another example. Let's go ahead and say that we have the note E flat, and let's say that we also have the note D. Okay, now we need to label what type of interval is this. Well, again, we could just start off on the right foot and we could say, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. So we have 7 fingers up, so we know that this is going to be some form of 7. And by the way, a quick way to do that, if you see really large intervals, which I think I mentioned before, just note that D is like 1 step away from E, which would be an octave. So rather than counting all the way up, just think of the octave and go down, and 7ths become really easily recognizable because E to E would be an octave, so E to D must be a 7th. But if we have E flat going up to D, we want to ask ourselves, what type of interval is that? We know that E flat is going to be our sort of temporary tonic. And again, we could say that the key signature of E flat major is B flat, E flat, and A flat. So as a result, because none of those 3 accidentals apply to this note, we know that that must be a major 7th because that is the form of 7th that is automatically created by the major scale. Now, in terms of recognizing perfect intervals, namely the 4th and 5th, because the octave is pretty easy to recognize, the octave is the octave. It's either the same pitch at the top and bottom or it's not. And if it's the same, then it is a perfect octave. If it's C and C, it's an octave. If it's E flat and E flat, it's an octave. But 4ths and 5ths can be a little trickier to immediately spot, but there are a few things that can really help us. So, for example, I think it's pretty easy to just start memorizing that C to F is a perfect fourth, because it's a really common way to sort of show that interval in music. C major is a common key, and even if we're not in C major, we see the notes C and F very frequently. Because we know that relative to the major scale, C to F is a perfect fourth, I really recommend you just try to really have that memorized. C to F equals a perfect fourth, just like C to G equals a perfect fifth. But there's a really great thing in terms of accidentals with these perfect intervals, and it would be true with the octave, but again, those are easier to spot. You'll notice here that if C to F is a perfect fourth, notice there's no accidentals, or we could say like, F natural and C natural if we needed to write those for some reason, but you'll notice that they either have no accidentals or they have the same accidentals. And you'll notice then that C sharp to F sharp would also be a perfect fourth. I mean, and it stands to reason that, if C to F, which is this, is a perfect fourth, and if we raise each of those notes by a half step to C sharp and F sharp, well, it makes sense that it's a perfect fourth, but it's great because from a sort of visual iconographic standpoint, we can tell that if notes that are forming a perfect fifth or perfect fourth are written on the staff, with one exception, which I'll mention in a second, they almost always have the same accidentals with them. Another example over here, D to A is a perfect fifth, so therefore D flat and A flat would also be a perfect fifth. So in most examples of fourths and fifths, they will have the same accidentals. In other words, if I see D and A flat, that is not going to equal a perfect fifth. As we'll talk about in a future video, that's what we would call a diminished fifth. It is one half step too small to be a perfect fifth, but we can immediately tell at a glance that it is not a perfect fifth because they have different accidentals applied to them. We could also say that like C sharp to F is not going to be a perfect fourth, because again, the accidentals between them are not proper. We would want C sharp and F sharp in order for that to be true. So looking at the spacing between notes, which we talked about in a previous video, really helps us quickly recognize that that's a fourth or that's a fifth. And then in terms of the accidental placement, it helps us really quickly identify whether it's a perfect fourth or fifth, or whether it's another version of those, which again, we will talk about in the near future. Now, the one major exception to this, I've sort of outlined over here. If we involve the notes F and or B, but really both of them together, that's where we are no longer going to hold that rule to be true, because the distance from F to B flat is a perfect fourth. And you'll notice that they do not have the same interval. One has a flat and the other does not, but they sound as such, which is a perfect fourth, just as F sharp to B is also a perfect fourth, even though they have separate accidentals. And, if you think about the keyboard, that makes some degree of sense, because you might remember that the notes F and B are the only notes that are a half step away from their neighbor notes. There's no black keys between B and C and F and E. So it makes sense that these notes might get treated a little differently from an accidental standpoint. So when identifying fourths and fifths, if it's something other than F and B, like for example, C sharp and F sharp, or D and A flat, well, not A flat because that one's wrong, but maybe like D flat and A flat, or C and F, or C sharp and F sharp, or D and A, or D flat and A flat, look for the spacing to identify quickly whether it's a fourth or fifth, and then if they have matching accidentals, it's a perfect version of that interval. But if we have the notes F and B involved, just note that for those to be perfect intervals, they will in fact have mismatched accidentals, and we'll talk a little bit more about identifying these and how they're different from their augmented and diminished cohorts, just like we will talk about with these other ones, again, in the very near future. Just a quick note that in terms of thirds, or our major third, as we are talking about in this video, that rule of accidentals does not apply, so I just want to make sure I qualify to make sure you don't sort of mix that up, because the distance from B flat to D is a major third, and the distance from F to A is also a major third, but you'll notice there's no consistency with those, the labeling of accidentals. So just keep in mind that the major and minor third, and we'll talk about the minor third in the near future, but that rule is not going to apply to those. So when it comes to labeling or identifying major thirds, I would just adhere to that concept of, well, pretend that, F is my temporary tonic, so as a result, I know that a major third up must be A, because again, the key signature of F only has B flat in it. So I would sort of stick to that. And again, especially the smaller intervals, the major second, the minor third, the major third, you'll really start to recognize those on sight pretty quickly. Like, for example, if I see G to B, I know that's a major third, and if I see G to B flat, I know that's a minor third. Again, that's a topic for the future, but really, these are things that the longer you look at them, the more you label them, they'll really start to sink in, and you'll be amazed at how quickly you can really have any interval from any one pitch to another really start to sink in. And another shout out to musictheory.net. There are ways to practice these, drilling and labeling of intervals. So I highly recommend you do that, because as part of your final exam, you will need to label and recognize these intervals in a very short time span. So that is all for this lecture. We will have other lectures for this week that include more information on the minor scale, as well as our starting to build triads, so we can actually start to build chords that sound, like this, which is really exciting. So look for those videos as well. And then in the future modules, we will also continue our discussion of intervals. We will talk about minor intervals, augmented intervals, diminished intervals, and then briefly talk about compound intervals, which are our intervals that are larger than an octave. But that is all for now, and this should give you all the information you need to complete the worksheets relating to intervals for this week.